Right. It's 10:21, and we set to finish it again at 15. We really are open to pitching. So I think we'll get on with it and also try to have enough room for a solid conversation. Good. At ka legaw dito sa like a secret planning fund. My name is Phamodi. I work with the New Economy Hub, an initiative of the African Climate Foundation, who work to build and amplify social support for net zero pathways that will help us to build a new economy in South Africa that's not only socially inclusive, unlike the one that we currently have, but also ecologically sustainable. Because unless we haven't noticed, we are living through a mass extinction event that we really have to rally towards responding to and resolving for the sake of our survival and that of our children, quite literally, right? Now, I've been invited to moderate the session today. So I'm bringing some important back to some really big brains and leading thinkers on the topic today. This topic is really on the small business sector, inclusive growth, and industrial policy. I think just simply being here at this forum and this theme, it's very clear why this topic is really important. And why we want to have this conversation. But more significantly, I think just looking at the content and having worked through the presentation that our esteemed speakers have prepared for us to take us through, the session is really a content session, a data session, just to set the scene for us to be able to frame the conversations that we're going to have all through the forum of the next 2 days, but also in between sessions in our networking and so forth. Because we ultimately want to have evidence-led conversations, evidence-led thinking, and evidence-led policy advocacy and action around how we really think about it, or rather transform our thinking around international policy in South Africa in response to the socio-technological transition that is happening, namely the energy transition, which is the first of a wide range of other sectoral transitions responding to the mass extinction event. As many of us are calling it at this. Now, joining me today are Lesego Moshikaro-Amani from Research and Tips, and she will be presenting to us on, really just understanding the small business landscape in South Africa through the data. She'll then be followed by Professor Justin Visagie, who's a senior research specialist of urban economies at the Human Social Research Council, as well as an associate professor at the University of the Free State, who will talk us through the contribution that SMMEs really make to the South African economy, and looking at spatial tax data in particular. I think these two, having looked at the presentations already, and noting some interesting, not necessarily contradictions, but contestations between the data. I think we're going to really have quite a fascinating and rich discussion together. But just to kind of set the scene and just remind us of key things here. One, the National Development Plan proposes that by 2030, SMMEs should contribute 90% of all new jobs, right? However, the context that we find ourselves in is that growth in productive capacity of the economy at large, never mind SMMEs, has been sluggish at best. This is linked certainly to the COVID pandemic and its impact on the economy, and certainly our economy being at a lower middle income status. And then, of course, the perennial energy crisis that we've been going through for the better part of the last 20 years. Although we are starting to see, we hope, that we are starting to see the green shoots of hope and improvement, given that we've paid for it all through last year. Now, all of these things come together in the context, of course, of a hostile in the context of hostile conditions in the global economy, and then of course the impact of the climate crisis on how economies are being thought about, understood, and being reorganized. And I want to reference here measures like the carbon border adjustment mechanism that is online in Europe and online in the US in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act, and then of course the developing carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are coming up in G7 countries, which are causing trade wars, right? For our industrial base and our export base as well. And all of this goes to impact our SMMEs in particular, but also what has been keeping our economy going in the main, which has been our minerals industry, our minerals extractions industry, right? So we really need to be thinking about all of these things together. And I'm hoping that the esteemed speakers that are joining me today are going to be able to take us through some of the big picture issues that we need to be thinking through, but based on the granular data that we need to be attentive to. And so with that, I'd like to invite Lesego to please kick us off and take us through the data that she's assembled for us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Good morning. Are the people online able to see my presentation? Hi, everyone. Hi again. So while they're busy trying to sort us out online, I'm just going to speak through what I will be looking into today. So I'll be looking at the small business sector in South Africa, analyzing key trends from 2010 all the way up to the fourth quarter of 2022. And the analysis that will be presented in the presentation is from our small business real economy bulletin, which is a tracker that aims to track data in the small business sector over time, which helps us in terms of understanding this ecosystem a lot better, but also trying to see where the key trends are, and also seeing in terms of the small business sector, how some of the shocks, for example, and also some of the domestic challenges impact on the small business sector in South Africa. And also this helps us in terms of thinking about support, in terms of policy, how can we actually ensure that we are creating a small business sector that is resilient to some of these shocks, but also one that also has policy support measures and programs to ensure that when these shocks happen, then small businesses are supported. And I think this is also part of the bigger conversation around in terms of data. It becomes important for not just only benchmarking South Africa against peer economies to see how South Africa's small business sector is doing, but also in terms of allowing us to evaluate how we're actually meeting some of the national targets, for example, that we've set in terms of the small business sector. As was mentioned in the NDP, there was a target that was set for small business sectors. So the data really allows us to see if we are meeting that target or not. And I think also some of the data that I'll be presenting, it really does speak to the issue around inclusivity as we look at the distribution of small businesses by industry, but also by geography as well. So really trying to understand the small business landscape and what it looks like, not only in urban areas, but also in historic labor-saving regions. We also look at the demographics of small businesses and also their contribution to employment, because we know that if we are to create employment opportunities in South Africa, then we really need to look at better supporting the small business sector in the country. And yeah, once we're ready, I will be taking you through the data, just again, looking at understanding the landscape a lot better and seeing how COVID impacted on the sector, as well as the important contributions to employment, to value add, and then, yeah, just trying to also look at it in terms of inclusivity and the demographics, looking at, for example, race, gender, and also in the small business sector. So getting into the data, so we look at the number of small businesses in the country. So we looked at employers and the contract workers who are self-employed and they don't employ other people. And so in terms of the data that we look at, this is data from Census A, primarily looking at the quarterly labor force data, as well as the annual financial statistics data. So when it comes to the number of small businesses in South Africa, we see that it's actually increased over time. And by 2019, we actually had 680,000 small businesses in South Africa in the formal sector. But we do see the impact of COVID-19 on the small business sector. And so what we saw was that there was actually a 25% in the decline of small businesses as a result of COVID. But then since our data goes up to the fourth quarter of 2022, we saw that there was actually a recovery by the fourth quarter of 2022. And so small business sector numbers had actually reached 710,000. And we also look at informal businesses as part of our analysis. And we see that informal businesses fell more sharply compared to small businesses at the start of the pandemic. And I think that also speaks to the support and the relief that we saw from government, that it was mostly targeted at the small formal enterprises, whereas informal businesses, in most cases, were not actually eligible for any of the relief support. And when looking at the small business sector in South Africa in totality, and this is up until, again, the fourth quarter of 2022, what we see is we had approximately 2.5 million small businesses, and this also includes 1.75 million informal businesses in the country. And again, so we're also working on updating the small business REB edition, and it's going to include the data for 2023. And I think it'll be interesting because we do know that the impact of last year's load shedding had quite a severe impact on small businesses, which led to some of the closures. So I think it'll be interesting to see that data and see how the small business sector was actually impacted by that. So this is a slide that Neva also spoke to, so I'll briefly just touch on it, but we also looked at small businesses as a percentage of total employment in South Africa compared to other upper middle income countries. And so what we found is that small business owners make up over 20% of the working age population in upper middle income countries, but in South Africa, this percentage is only 6%, which is pretty low. And I think this is the number that we really need to look into increasing and really see how we can support the sector better to grow this number. So we know that the business sector is an important contributor to employment. And so we looked at employment in millions by sector. And what we found was that in South Africa, when we are looking at small business sector, especially small formal businesses, it actually generated 30% of total employment in the country and 32% of all wage jobs. And this includes informal jobs as well as domestic work. We also look at employment by size. And so for the 2019 data, what we see for own account workers, these again are workers who don't employ anyone else. We see that they actually operated a quarter of small businesses. So half of the small businesses in the formal sector had between 1 and 20 employees, while just under 1 in 10 had between 20 and 49 employees. And when we're looking at the informal business sector, for example, we see a slightly different picture. As shown in the graph, we can see that in the informal sector, own account workers dominated the sector. So 4 out of 5 informal enterprises, for example, were run by own account workers. And I think that speaks to also how some of the business owners in the informal enterprises are actually doing so as a means of survival. And when we look at, for example, other employees, we see that virtually all of the rest of informal enterprises had 4 or fewer employees. We also looked at median monthly earnings. This is from the labor market dynamics data from StatSA, and we see that wage worker earnings in formal small businesses range between 25% and 30% of the employer's reported income, and this was in the 2010s. In the 2010s, but then it climbed to almost 50% by 2020. What we also see, for example, when we're looking at informal employers, we see that they actually earned, this is one of the last bars, that side, but we see that when it comes to informal employers, they actually earn slightly more than formal waged workers. But for informal on-account workers and employees, they actually earn considerably less. So we actually also look at conditions of employment for employees or wage workers who are in the small business sector. So this is looking at social security, for example, and benefits, including whether there's paid leave, UIF, as well as pension. And we do a comparison between formal and informal small businesses, but also comparison with large formal enterprises. And what we see is that in the formal sector, formal conditions for small enterprises lag only slightly behind those of large formal enterprises. But then when we are looking at informal businesses, for example, we see that these provided not only low incomes, but also very low job security. So this looks at the distribution of small businesses in South Africa by sector. And what we see when we're looking at formal enterprises is that we see that approximately a fifth of private formal businesses were provided by professional services. And these services include, for example, education, healthcare, legal services, as well as engineering services. And then a quarter of private formal businesses were in retail, as well as in hospitality. And when looking at informal sector, we do see this big chunk here where almost all, half of all the businesses were actually in trade, retail trade, sorry. And this was followed by the construction sector, which is in green over here. And when we're looking at professional services, for example, in the informal sector, we saw that they only account for 5% of informal businesses. So we looked at education as well, so the level of qualification according to business ownership. And I think this shows quite an interesting picture where it shows that close to half of formal and own-account workers have a post-matric qualification. And I think that demonstrates the correlation between having post-matric qualification and also being in the small formal business sector. When it comes to workers, for example, in smaller enterprises, they were slightly less educated than those in larger companies. And also, we saw that at least 42% of waged workers had a matric. And then only 8 had a degree compared to the 11% in larger businesses. And when we look at the informal sector, for example, we see that under 5% of employers and own account workers had a degree, and almost 2/3 did not have a matric. And then getting into race and gender, the graph shows that in the early 2000s, particularly starting from 2002, white people owned 60% of small business enterprises in South Africa, despite them making 7% of the working age population in the country. But then we're also seeing a decline in the share of this ownership. And so it's declined to 40%, and it's also remained around there. And then again, looking at race, we see that Black people actually have consistently over time owned 95% of informal businesses in the country. And when we're looking at gender, we see that women own around a quarter of small formal businesses, but half of these women were white women. And then in the informal sector, for example, the share of women entrepreneurs, as we can see here, has actually declined over time. So in 2010, it was 45%, but then in 2022, the fourth quarter, it actually declined to 35%. And I think that also speaks to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on women. So we looked at median monthly earnings according to race and gender. And for the 2019 data, what we saw is that the median earnings of a white man, for example, who owned a small formal business were actually twice as high as those for Black men, as well as Black women, and also for white women. And in terms of For youth, we looked at business owners and wage workers by sector and age group. And what the graph here shows is that in 2019, for the 2019 data, the median age for wage workers in the sector was 35. And in 2002, which is the most recent data we have, is that 4% of young people aged 15 to 34 were business owners. And this equated to 15% of all youth employed in the country. And I think that that is quite a concerning number, especially in the context that we find ourselves with high youth unemployment. But the youth also face, different challenges to some of the 35 to 64 age group, for example. So I think it becomes important for us when we are thinking about inclusion to also ensure that we are creating policies that are targeted at youth, SMMEs, and make sure that the inclusion is one that is intentional, because what we see with youth SMMEs is that they also actually employ other youth as well. And that's particularly really important. And I think it's also important that in terms of the data, of course, we use the QLFS data, which is reliable. But I think also there are some gaps to data where I think it will be important to also include qualitative data that also looks at some of the challenges that we know that youth SMMEs experience. And this would be, for example, conducting interviews with these SMMEs to really try and understand these challenges and how industrial policy can better support the youth in terms of, for example, training, in terms of market access opportunities, as well as in terms of funding. So amongst people aged 35 and over, 10% of the total population owned a business, which equal to 21% of the employed. Okay, so we also looked at, looking at the education of formal and informal businesses by age group, we saw that those aged 15 to 34 had higher education levels than adults, and also young business owners were almost as likely to have a degree as their older peers and much more likely to have a matric. And we are seeing the youth or younger people staying in school more. So that is one of the factors that contributes to this. And then the geography, we saw that when looking at the number of formal and informal businesses across the country, the 5 largest metros being Johannesburg, Cape Town, Ekurhuleni, Tshwane, and eThekwini, they actually have a third of the population, but they dominate in terms of economic activities, and this is including a small business sector as well. So for example, we've seen over time that small business sector, especially formal businesses in these metros, has actually increased to about 60%. And the 5 biggest metros also held 45% of informal businesses in the country. And then when we look at historic labor sending areas, rural areas, what we see is that there is formal small businesses are limited in these regions. And even though these regions held around a quarter of the population in 2022, but then when looking at small formal enterprises, they actually only held 5% of small formal enterprises. And when it comes to informal enterprises, we see that they held about 27%, and the share had fallen from 30-something% in 2010. How many minutes do I have left? Okay, cool. I'm just going to do key takeaways from just what I presented. And it's that the number of small businesses in South Africa is improving, and we've also seen a recovery post-COVID. And South Africa does lag behind when compared to other upper middle income countries. And I didn't go through the value add slide, but from our analysis, we estimate that small businesses directly generate a third of value add in South Africa. And for informal enterprises, that's around 5%. And then also in terms of employment, small businesses generate 30% of total employment and 32% of all waged employment in South Africa. And then lastly, close to half of formal business owners in South Africa have a post-matric qualification. And also in terms of race, we see that Black people have consistently owned around 95% of informal enterprises. And then just to close off, 4% of young people aged 15 to 34 were business owners, which equated to 15% of all employed youth. And I just want to mention that we are actually working on updating this edition. And so we would really appreciate feedback in terms of where some gaps are and how we can really try to improve this tracking database that we're working on, because I think it really becomes important, as it was mentioned, that when we are thinking about industrial policy, and especially inclusive industrial policy, to ensure that we do have evidence-based data and research supporting that.
So much, Lesego. And we'll just move right along and welcome Professor Visagie, who's going to take us through the spatial tax data and then raise some very interesting questions and contestations along the way. Thanks.
Okay, well, it's great to be at the TIPS Forum, and it's good to be in a panel with Lesego. Thank you. I think this follows on really nicely in that talking about what is the actual evidence for SMMEs in the country. I think it's a really important issue. The context for myself is I'm new to thinking about small business. So I wouldn't say I'm an expert on small business, working mainly on city region economies. And so someone who's sort of coming in from a distance, I'm really hoping that some of these provocations can land, or maybe you can take me on and say I'm barking up the wrong tree. But it really struck me that there was a lot of speculation about SMMEs when I started to look into it, and not enough hard evidence about what's really going on. And this is partly due to a weakness within our statistical ecosystem. So, we've got a lot of information about households and household surveys, but if you flip that and try and investigate what's happening to firms, you'll find that we don't have that same maturity. And particularly when you want to sort of analyze firms at a granular level or a micro level. 1, 2. Okay, I hope I haven't been lost online. So when we're trying to look at what's happening into the South African economy and understanding it from the FIRB side of things, we find that our statistical infrastructure is a lot weaker. So there are a few options. I think one of the important ones is looking at the QLFS, okay, which is a quarterly labor force survey, but you're still looking at it primarily from the side of households. And this is sort of an open question whether you're really going to capture, certainly from the formal side of things, small businesses by going to households. The other two popular tools out there is the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. It's a 3,000 person sample of the adult population, but again, it's going through households, as well as Finmark, who do a 5,000 sample of individuals. I think when you look at what the Department of Small Business itself has to. Okay, let me try this one. Sheesh. I thought I was entertaining, but clearly I need to up the energy level here. Thank you. Okay, let's get on with it. So found this quote from the recent SMME and cooperative funding policy. It says in South Africa, there's a lack of reliable data on small business, and obtaining an accurate count of the numbers is a challenge. And interestingly, there in that policy, it cites that there's going to be a database for small business and aggregating number of sources, and they've got a website. I did go there. Fortunately, it doesn't work. So if you're responsible for that portal, come and talk to us so we can see what we can do. But one of the opportunities is actually looking at administrative data, right? And that's the way in which the world is changing, that we've got information flows that are happening all the time. So we need to leverage these administrative sources. So I've been involved with a larger project known as the Spatial Tax Panel, supported by National Treasury's City Support Program, also funded by the FCDO. I see we've got Shabri with us today. Hi, Shabri. And it's been an important project because, people filling out tax records and this administrative data flow provides a real opportunity to have granular information. And why it's also important is that particularly when we're trying to track things over time with surveys, you'll find that actually the accuracy of that information can be a challenge. So, you can compare two numbers over time, but is it a statistically significant difference? That's a challenge that you have with surveys, particularly when you're trying to force it down into wage levels or to sort of do the cross tabulations. And I think that that's something that could be a value addition for the tips tracker, is to try and get that sense of how accurate the calculations are. The advantage of tax data, administrative data, is that you're getting a comprehensive sample of the community that you're collecting it for. Of course, a big weakness is that administrative data only collects for who it collects. So I'm going to be approaching this question from the side of the tax records. And so that is the formal sector. So we're talking about formal small businesses. Another limitation is that there can be issues in the measurement of where businesses are located if firms don't report all their information at a localized level. So if you just aggregate all your information up for the head office, and yet you've got branches all over the country, that can include some bias. So that's also something to be aware of. But anyway, I think a really important resource for exploring local economies, and one to tackle the question of small business. And just to draw your attention that if you go to spatialtaxdata.org.za, there's an interactive tool where you can actually explore what's happening in local economies using this tool. Okay, a lot could be said about the spatial tax data, but just to say, administrative source, going into a lab to actually access real records, but of course, only the formal sector. What definition do we apply for formal business? Well, SARS has a definition that classifies it in terms of gross income, turnover, and total assets. But this disadvantage of this is that it drops out firms that are, for instance, not-for-profits. It drops out the government sector, etc. So, and we also have issues with maturity because it's based on the ITR 14 tax form. So a cleaner and neater way is just to say, okay, well, how many employees does a particular business have? And so that's the approach that we go. So we talk about micro firms being 0 to 9 employees, small being 10 to 49, medium being 50 to 249, and then large being 250 to 999, and very large being 1,000. And it's really interesting in the data to make that distinction between large and very large, because you can see very large play a very large role actually in the South African economy. The other thing to note is that we're interested in understanding the spatial dynamics. So our unit of analysis here is an establishment. So that's a branch in particular places. Of course, branches you can aggregate together for a firm at a national level, but we're talking about establishments or branches in most cases. So where does South Africa stand? And I think Lesego already sort of pointed out that we're an outlier in that small business actually underperforms when you look at the South African economy. One big reason, and if Neva highlighted this, is self-employment in the informal economy, which is depressed compared to many African countries. But it's not just a story about self-employment. If you actually look at the formal sector, we know that South Africa has been dominated by a lot of big industry players with very high concentration ratios. So this is an issue for informal and formal firms, is participation of SMMEs. So here, this is just a latest report from McKinsey. It gives you some sense of numbers. They said 77% of jobs for emerging economies, 66% of jobs in advanced economies. I tried to find from the tips and from ThinScope what they had to say about the formal labor. ThinScope, I don't know how they say this, but they said it was 87% of total labor force. I just think that's incorrect. So let's have a fight after the session. And tips, this seemed a lot more reliable, and although the number's a bit higher than what was reported in the presentation, but it was about half of waged work, which sort of seems more plausible. So what does the tax data actually have to say? So this is a really interesting figure. The first is just counting up the number of establishments according to these categories. So you can see that green being the micro, 53.7% of all establishments. Then small being the orange, 25.4%, and then medium, 9.4%. So when you just count the numbers of businesses, you'll see that it's heavily skewed towards SMMEs. But of course, small business might only employ one person, whereas one very large firm could employ more. So if we look at it, not in terms of the contribution of numbers, but actually what they do for employment, that's the figure we have on the right-hand side. You can see how much it flips over, right? So micro firms, even though they're 53.7% of all the formal businesses, they only contribute 7.1% to employment. And actually very large firms, which is the purple at the top, does the other way around. There are only 6.7% of all establishments out there, but 46% of all employment. So a disproportionate contribution. So having a look at these numbers, we think that actually SMMEs, and again, formal SMMEs, are contributing about only 40% of South Africa's formal employment. Of course, it would be a bit higher with the informal sector added in, but I think it's easy to say that no matter how you slice it or dice it, South African small firms underperform in terms of their contribution to employment. Of course, the key question is how is this changing over time? Have we noticed any change? And this is a really interesting graph, and I'm still trying to digest it myself. So here we're trying to track changes in employment over time, and we index it at 100 at the start, the base year being 2014. And that means that any number after that would be the percentage change. So if you go from 100 to 110, that would be a 10% change over the period. So the dotted blue line is the national average. And first, it's important just to realize that from 2014 to 2020, that's the tax year. So 2019, 2020. So just sort of as COVID struck at that high point, the national economy in terms of formal employment only grew by about 10 percentage points. So it's like 1.5 percentage points growth per annum. So we're in a context of stagnation, right? So not great performance. But when you look at the different size of firms over time, we actually see quite encouraging signs for SMMEs. You can see that the dark green being micro, actually right at the top, and then clustered together small and medium. Interestingly, large also features in there. So what causes a lot of the stagnation is in fact the fact that our very large firms are not investing and not performing and not growing. And the percentage point increase between 2014 and 2020 was only 3 percentage points over that sort of, I think it's 7-year period or so. So really low growth, and that depresses the whole picture. I haven't focused my presentation so much on what's happening post-COVID, although I think it's an interesting question. You can see the trends there from 2020 onwards. But it does seem that there's this sort of shift where a lot of the other businesses take a knock, but micro businesses start up. So this could be sort of this necessity-driven entrepreneurship. So interesting that micro firms actually buck the trend in terms of switching to that post-COVID. We can ask this question again to say, okay, well, of all the new jobs created over this period, 2013, 14 to 2019, 2020, so up until the peak before COVID, where did the jobs come from? And you can see that actually SMMEs created 66.2% of all the jobs. So I think that's a really encouraging sign. But notice micro firms, if you go back to that slide, had a huge growth rate, but their contribution in absolute numbers will still be small. And that's because they're working off a small base. So they only contribute 15.2% of new jobs, whereas very large firms, despite not growing and not performing, end up contributing the same. And I think it's important to bear in mind how our economy fits together, and that if very large firms are underinvesting, it's going to hold back the whole system, even if it's a more positive story for SMMEs. One bit of independent evidence which gives me some comfort that we're on the right track here is from the annual financial statistics from Stats SA, and it's essentially looking at the same sample that we're working here in the tax data. And they said that small businesses have, without much fanfare, slowly taken over more of the turnover pie. In 2013, small businesses generated 16% of total turnover, expanding to 22% in 2019. Whereas large businesses waned over the period. And we are adding in that nuance to say, actually, it's not the 250 to 999 category, it's the It's those very large businesses that are depressing the performance. So good news for SMMEs, but I suppose a bad story about South Africa's general economic health. What about industry and where these different SMMEs come from? Well, you generally hear a story of SMMEs being less tradable and less dynamic, a lot of retail, a lot of sort of what we'd call locally traded services. It's interesting that the formal shares are pretty even across a number of sectors. So yes, retail is still number one, but this figure needs to be updated. Something's gone wrong. It should read 18%, not 1.8. My apologies. But manufacturing is number two at 16%. So I was quite surprised to see that. And then you've got agriculture, construction, administrative services. Those are things like security, cleaning, very low skilled. And then professional services would be lawyers, accountants, engineering services, etc. High-end services, number 6. But quite an interesting split, but certainly not just a story of locally traded goods. What about the intensity of the employment? So this looks within each sector and says, well, what's the share of SMMEs in that sector? And it points towards potential barriers to entry in different sectors. And what you can see is number one ranked, well, not really surprising, is government. Doesn't really have small businesses by the nature of what government and government entities are. They're big things. But mining is number two. So, our mining industry, continues to perform poorly, but that is a story of big business performing poorly. And then as you go from left to right, you can sort of see how things are ordered. What's quite interesting is on the other side of things where SMMEs have a greater share is real estate, but they're a really small share of total employment. Construction, those professional services. I've said they're tourism, but it's like your hotels, your accommodation, restaurants, those sorts of things. So that all seems to make sense with our expectations. You can look at it by combining the lens of sector and jobs and SMMEs over time to see where it came from. And I think what's interesting to see is that, on the right-hand side, we see very large firms by sector. And you can see how it's sort of a mixed bag. So there are some sectors in which very large firms actually did pretty well. You can see retail is one of them, and you can see government continues to employ to a less extent things like ICT, but clearly other sectors within very large that pulled things back. So like mining in particular. And manufacturing, whereas SMMEs were more consistent performers. And in some sectors, there's a sort of the start of what could be a swing, but it might be in the early stage. So you see in construction, very large firms doing poorly, whereas SMMEs still continuing to grow. Same for education and ICT and for manufacturing. I thought that was really interesting. So in terms of our industrialization path, it seems SMMEs have been more successful. So I wanted to tips. So I wanted to just quickly zoom into manufacturing and see the different subsectors. And this is, again, one of the advantages of using administrative sources is that we can get this fine-grained detail to really probe and go deeper if we want to. So you can see that at the 2 digits sectoral classification, you can break manufacturing down into a range of different activities. And it's clearly not all of our manufacturing that's doing poorly. If you look at food and beverages, for instance, creating jobs, and in fact, it creates jobs across all different firm sizes. But it's the very large firms, particularly in heavy manufacturing, that are the ones that have been bleeding jobs. And it talks to this need for us to have the structural transformation and a transition in our economy. And the pain that can be involved in the process. Whereas large and medium firms, it's still interesting that large and medium actually did still outperform the small and the micro in manufacturing. So it was, in some sense, it's the very large manufacturers that are losing a lot of jobs, whereas, SMMEs plus large firms doing better. Okay. We can look at a whole lot of range of other things, and I've sort of run out of time to take you through all the statistics. But just to say that, we look at SMMEs, but they can't do everything for us. So if you look at the correlation between exports and imports and firm size, clearly the larger firms, bigger firms, are more successful at exporting or importing, whereas it sort of rises as you grow in size. Big question is about local economies, and I'll be my last stat, and I'll just jump to my key messages. And it's come out the importance of cities. So the figure on the left shows just the total number of businesses, and you can see that concentration in metros. But also if you weight it by employment, again, the concentration in metros, although very large, is a bigger share. And that makes sense, right? Because that's where the majority of our population is, and that's the way in which agglomeration and scale economies work in reality. But you can look at something like this where you say, okay, well, what share of employment belongs to SMMEs within each municipality? And this is saying the total number of SMMEs. And actually, there's again a story that there seems to be more room for smaller businesses, again, down in the Western Cape, up towards Gauteng, and in each of the metros, you'll see a darker color. So it seems that our cities have an important incubation role to play in creating an environment for participation. But if I switch that to look at where employment is, more difficult to judge. Anyway, so I'm going to skip over some of these other slides, but just to say that, as you would expect, when you look at SMMEs and wages, for instance, you'll see that larger firms pay their employees better. And if you look at it along dimensions of gender, actually you also find that the very large firms had better outcomes. So, these are the tensions and trade-offs that we need to think about in our industrial policy. So what are some of our provocations to have discussion over the course of the next 2 days? I think the first thing is that we need more realism in our policy about SMMEs. So, the NDP envisioned that 90% of all new jobs would be created by SMMEs. And that's just not realistic considering what we have as our economy. Large firms play a large role in South Africa. And even though that needs to change, I think we can't ignore their importance to the overall ecosystem. Their contribution by SMEs is modest. Less than 40% of formal jobs. And if you exclude medium firms, it falls down to about 20%. But having said that, SMME performance over recent times has been encouraging, bucking the trend. And so hopefully we can see more of this. But of course, SMME is also more constrained in terms of their pay levels, their shares of female employment for youth, as well as participation in export markets. So I think we also need to clarify the role of SMMEs that we expect for economic development. In some ways, SMMEs make a less contribution to employment by definition. They're smaller, and small firms will become large firms when they're successful. So should we rather be actually targeting rates of survival, or should we be monitoring the levels of churn and the incubation role rather than directly worrying about how much employment? I think these are some of the things we need to think carefully about. And I also think these geographical differences, which I had to really zoom over, also are important to highlight the role of the local ecosystems. So, there's huge variation in the number of SMMEs and the share for SMMEs, and some of that can be explained by the economic sector. But I don't think that that's the full story. Clearly, there's some places that are creating more opportunities for SMMEs and are more supportive. And that's important to focus. And the metros will always need to be a priority, just in terms of international evidence about their role in incubation. And I think it also points to not thinking about SMMEs in a simplistic way. So the survivalist informal enterprise, which my data hasn't been able to talk to, is very important for poverty reduction, livelihoods, but it's not going to drive GDP or decent wages, right? Whereas small fintech and knowledge-intensive business services will create value addition, profit, could even export, but is not going to absorb labor. So these are the tensions we need to be aware of. And our conventional small business services, for instance, locally traded accommodation, you know, food and beverages, hairdressing, all of those conventional small business, you know, they might create a lot of jobs, but they're not going to drive a dynamic economy in the long run. So a mixed bag by sector, subsector, geography. There's not a panacea. Small business is not going to solve everything for everyone. And I think that we need to understand these tensions and be more upfront about it in policy and discussion. So looking ahead, thanks for letting me have a little bit more time here. I think administrative data is an untapped resource for M&E of SMMEs. It shows a lot of potential. And I think we need this fine-grained kind of data to capture the heterogeneity. But there's lots of gaps. We need more research to understand the different forms of entrepreneurship and their role, right? As I said, you know, different informal sector compared to formal sector, you know, it can be like comparing apples and oranges, both important in different ways. And so can we understand those and maximize the potential in each case? Can we also understand the life cycle, not just at one static point in time, but these dynamics, the role that SMMEs play in progressing from small into large and being successful? I think that's a big missing. And then lastly, this issue of local ecosystems. What are these barriers and enablers that are happening in local economies? How do we understand what's going on more to unlock potential? So thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Justin. Goodness, thanks so much, Justin. So it is 11:18. And officially our tea time. I nevertheless want to invite just maybe one round of maybe 3 questions at max to our 2 speakers to maybe ask further questions or maybe push back at some of the provocations that we've heard before we wrap it up and head out. So just quickly by show of hands. Okay, I'm seeing 2, 3, 4. 5. 6. Okay. So here's what we're going to do, right? We're going to take them in 2 rounds then. It seems like everyone is content to stay here and have this conversation just a little bit further. We will have to close at 12:30 so that you do have a tea and body break. You need it. So I'm going to start here towards the front of the room. There was a question from the gentleman here in the front desk, the lady in the row behind him. And then there was a further question from this end. Oh, no, it was from this lady, yes, with the fuchsia top. So we'll start there. Then in the queue, there was a hand, I think more or less in the middle of this quadrant here. No? Yeah, yes, it was the gentleman. Yeah, it was the gentleman. There was a hand from a lady at the back. Just a moment, please. Yeah, it was the lady there in the back, right? And then we'll take this lady here at the end, and then those will be the 2 rounds that we have. So you all know your place in the queue, right? So let's hand it over. We'll start with the gentleman over here in the front. Thank you.
So it's a question for Justin, I just want to get at Demisani Mkonza from ABSA. I just want to get some thoughts from Justin and Lesego social enterprises, the extent that they can assist with job creation. You quoted some very great stats on very large. It seems like that's an area to possibly focus on. But I wanted to know if there's social enterprises play a role there.
Good morning. My name is Leah. I am from the Small Enterprise Development Agency, and I run a program called the She Trades Program. It's specifically focused on women entrepreneurs and also the Export Development Program. So both your thesis is very relevant to my area of work, especially with regards to yours, ma'am, where you talked about the youth in the industrial policy and the relevance. It would be very good as a way forward to focus on the women who are youth, and because developing a good industrial policy will ensure that the export arena is also cultivated. So that is one thing. And then the second one to you, Prof, is that based on my database, for example, especially after COVID, many of the women businesses had to close down because they had to look after their families. So that would be also one of the areas that you need to maybe focus in on how COVID affected many of the women entrepreneurs. Sorry, I'm speaking for the women only.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Masoko Mayebu, and I'm from Visagie Consulting. So I've bottled them up. It goes both to Prof. Visagie and to Lesego. So I think I was quite fascinated by the whole on-account SME. And I think there might be a need to relook how we look at those SMEs, because you do have high net worth individuals that consider how they run their business or trading in terms of their skills as co-creators and collaborators. So you have not necessarily a team that you appoint at a full-time scale, but you acquire whatever services as and when it requires to do so. And perhaps more support as well from a policy perspective, because they do pay tax, right? At the end of the day. I think the one that I'm also quite interested in is, what is the correlation between the formal education and the SMEs? Do they last longer? What is the mortality rate? Or did we just look at from how many there are? And I think, Prof, you mentioned the issue of focusing on the metros. I think focusing on the metros, and you did this with Prof. Turuk, I believe, then we still continue to have those issues that we have a lot of migrations to the city centers, and all the other areas are left undeveloped.
Great, thanks. It's 11:24. Our panelists still got 6 minutes to respond to some pretty complex questions too. So we're just going to take it to past, and we'll only go through this round. With my apologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Leah. So I am familiar with some of the work that you've done around women, and I think that's definitely very important to ensure that when we are looking at industrial policy, particularly, you know, exports and access to markets, that women businesses are better supported. I think, yeah, so I think that was more of a statement than a question. And I think obviously your research is going to show and also highlight what the impact on that support has been for women, and also how industrial policy can actually better ensure that women enterprises and as well as youth-owned enterprises are actually better supported in an inclusive industrial policy. So yeah, I think in terms of the work that you're doing, it's pretty great. And I mean, I know you posed a question to Justin on how women businesses were impacted during COVID. And I mean, in our data, what we do is we don't really go much into it, but we can see that women businesses were disproportionately affected because of the fact that, you know, women had to pull out of those businesses or out of the labor market in order to take care, for example, of the household and childcare. And on account workers, I think that's very interesting, because for me, most of the time when I'm looking at own account workers, I think my focus is mostly on the informal workers. And I do think that for formal own account enterprises, they do play an important role, because you have mentioned that they do pay taxes, and it's definitely important to support them. But I think we also need to look at, for example, you know, how to grow those sectors in terms of actually enabling them to create employment in the economy. And on formal education, we haven't really looked at the correlation between formal education and the sustainability of SMEs, but I think that's definitely very interesting. But having a formal education background, for example, means that you do have some of the skills and some of the networks, whereas if you don't have education, or you don't have a matric qualification, for example, then you don't have some of those networks and also the skills. So we haven't done work on that, but I think that's definitely something that we can expand on and look into. Thanks.
Okay, I stand between your tea breaks. I'll get to the point. I think the broader comment is that both of our presentations won't solve all the issues, right? But I think it's really important that we try and understand some of the basic dimensions of the sector. Which sectors of the SMMEs have been creating the jobs? You know, what is the intensity for women like in different places? Otherwise, we just always wishful thinking about what we want without really tracking and getting into the detail about what's happening and where and why. But of course, it's a starting point to then go and do deeper work. Social enterprises and its opportunity for job creation. Yeah, I think it's massive. I think Neva touched a lot on this concept of extensive versus intensive development, and meaning that, you know, if you've got an economy and you're using all your resources, the only way to grow it would be by becoming more efficient, by having new technology. That's intensive growth. But extensive is you moving into new areas that haven't been explored before. And I think in South Africa's case, a lot of in the space of township economic development, social enterprises, here, these are spaces that I think small businesses need to infiltrate more into, and there's great opportunity there. In terms of women and COVID and its impact, that would be something that we can definitely look at in the tax data, is to actually say, we actually saw the spike in micro businesses, but what type of micro businesses, employing who, in what sectors? I think it deserves some looking into. Again, to reiterate that it's one thing to just look at the number of businesses, but I think it's more than just the numbers. It's about how are these firms evolving over time? There's issues of churn, of mortality, etc. And for that, again, you need longitudinal data. So the tax data that I was analyzed does present the opportunity to track a firm over time, and I think that's a big opportunity. Last but not least, what about rural development? And I think we need to reframe the question, because it's not either or. It's not about picking cities or rural areas. You know, if our cities aren't pumping, it's hard to imagine rural areas also thriving. So it's not a polarized choice. But I also think we need to realize there can be an attitude that our cities will look after themselves. And I don't think that that's a good frame of reference. The majority of what's happening in SMMEs, both in terms of just sheer concentration, but also in terms of rates of participation, are higher in the cities. I think they need to be supported, not at the expense of rural areas. Again, how do they complement one another? You'll probably find in rural areas more opportunity for agriculture, et cetera, where cities, different sorts of sectors. So again, we shouldn't be trying to trade one versus the other. But to emphasize that there can be an overemphasis on a small peripheral part of the whole picture, when actually we need to come to terms with where South Africans live and work and getting our cities functioning. And a last comment about that, it's not just about the excluded groups in rural areas, actually within our cities, township economies, informal settlements, a lot of spatial inequality plays itself out along numerous dimensions. And it's should be a key lens of our industrial policy, is those spatial implications, but not either or. Thanks.
Wonderful. Goodness, is this working? Am I audible? Excellent. Wonderful. Thanks so much to our two speakers, Professor Justin Visagie from the HSRC and University of the Free State, as well as, of course, Lesego, Moshikaro-Amani from TIPS, giving us really just a big picture view of what the data are telling us, how reliable they are, and how well they can tell the story or give us direction in terms of how we approach trade industrial policy formulation and action in order to be able to grow our SMME base in the country. Thank you so much for your contributions. Thank you so much for your questions and your patience. Let's break for lunch, for tea, and let's be back in our breakaway rooms by 11:45, which gives us a good 15 minutes for a quick body break, grabbing a bit of tea and a biscuit, maybe some fruit too, and then getting there. Thank you so much.